Alright everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Guns, Germs, and Steel, Chapter 10, looking at the impact of location and how it applies to the spread of food and wildlife. Chapter 10, Spacious Skies and Tilted Axes. This chapter will be about what I see as their enormous, sometimes tragic consequences. Axis orientations affected the rate of spread of crops and livestock, and possibly also of writing, wheels, and other inventions. That basic feature of geography thereby contributed heavily to the very different experiences of Native Americans, Africans, and Eurasians in the last 500 years. Basically, the idea here is the fact that because of longitudinal and biomes and how different areas affect wildlife as well as flora, we see how they have impacted not only the areas themselves, but how they have altered the progress of human civilization in those areas. Food production spread proves as crucial to understanding geographic differences in the rise of guns, germs, and steel as it did in its origins, which we considered in the predecessing chapters. That's because, as we saw in Chapter 5, there are no more than 9 areas of the globe, perhaps as few as 5, where food production arose independently. Basically, the idea is that because food arose independently in 5 different areas, and those areas had very specific packages, as we'll discuss in a little bit later, the idea here is that because they have these 5 different areas, or as many as 9 different areas that had specific growths that allowed for farming, and as well as animals that were able to be found in the area that we could domesticate, we can see how the formation of how these areas moved about. So if we take a look at the idea of a package, a set of crops that move from area to area, generally in conjunction with each other. So if you have an area that will be sustainable for all of them, they are going to be a lot better off. Whereas in different areas, and we'll mention this later, you can only have one of those crops that were found, in this case the Fertile Crescent, that weren't able to be used in other areas. Here's a basic breakdown of how things could have moved from their areas from high to low. So for instance, you're going to, in the Americas, see a movement north to south or south to north, whereas you're going to see the wider spread from, in Eurasia, east to west and back again. And you also have that African north to south, south to north perspective. Now, one of the benefits when we're talking about Eurasia is the fact that, if you notice, it is all going to be generally on the same longitudinal lines. Longitudinal lines is going to give our biggest factor when it's going to come to how the environment actually seems when it comes to particularly temperatures and seasonal changes. And when we can look at Eurasia, where they end up is where they're going to be able to move across more easily rather than north and south. Now, there are other factors we need to keep in mind. So in the instance of Eurasia, the fact is that moving across, straight across from, say, Europe, you're going to hit a mountainous area, where that means it's going to be a lot more difficult for those crops to be implemented as far as regular rotation in the foods. Just as some regions proved to be much more suitable than others for the origins of food production, the ease of its spread also varied greatly around the world. Some areas that are ecologically suitable for food production never acquired it in prehistorical times at all, even though the areas of prehistorical food production existed nearby. The idea here is that they're talking about is the fact that you have certain areas that had spontaneous growth, but it didn't move until much later, where areas where they seemed to make sense for the movement didn't actually happen at all, even though it seemed like there should have been. At one extreme was its rapid spread along the east-west axis, from Southwest Asia, both east to Europe and Egypt, and east in the Indus Valley, average rate of 0.7 miles per year, and from the Philippines to Polynesia at 3.2 miles per year. Basically, the idea here is we're trying to establish how long it took for certain places to receive the food and how fast that took. So for instance, when we're talking about per miles per year, we're looking over how long it took average over the course of a time frame for the food packages to be brought from those 5 to 9 areas where the food could be found. Those fertile crescents, as an example, which is the primary example that we use here, is that how long it took for the food that we see in the Fertile Crescent to actually show up in other places. At the opposite extreme was its slow spreading along the south-north axis. At less than 0.5 miles per year from Mexico northward to the U.S. southwest, at less than 0.3 miles per year for corn and beans from Mexico northward to become productive in eastern United States around AD 900, and at 0.2 miles per year for the llama from Peru north to Ecuador. This just shows that the north to south is actually a lot slower as opposed to east to west, like we discussed earlier. For instance, while most of Southwest Asia's founder crops and livestock did spread west to Europe and east to the Indus Valley, neither of the Andes domestic mammals, the llama/alpaca and the guinea pig, ever reached Mesoamerica in pre-Columbian times. So the idea here is just not the fact that we're talking about food, but we're also talking about livestock. The llama and alpaca and the guinea pig, which were both used as domestic mammals by the Native American population in Mesoamerica, they didn't spread as well as the livestock and crops did from east to west, and vice versa. Some South American crops nevertheless did succeed in reaching Mesoamerica, such as the manioc, sweet potatoes, and peanuts. What selective barrier let those crops through but screened out the llamas and guinea pigs? Here's the situation. The fact is that some crops were able to succeed in different areas, whereas certain types of foods, such as the llamas and guinea pigs, were prevented to do so. Most of the wild plant species from which our crops were derived varied genetically from area to area. Because alternative mutations had become established among the wild ancestral populations of different areas, similarly, the changes required to transform wild plants into crops can in principle be brought about by alternative new mutations or alternative courses of selection to yield equivalent results. In this light, one can examine a crop widespread in prehistoric times and ask whether all of its varieties show the same wild mutation, the same transforming mutation. Basically, the idea here is the fact that if you take a look at different crops, there are going to be variable factors when it comes to how it mutated to allow it to survive in different areas. And the question here is whether all of its varieties share the same mutation, which means that you're going to have a variety, you could have a variety of different mutations when it comes to how these plants show. One of the carries of such genetic analysis for major ancient New World crops, many of them proved to include 2 or more of those alternative wild variants, or 2 or more of those alternative transforming mutations. This suggests that the crop was domesticated independently in at least 2 different areas, and that some varieties of the crop inherited the particular mutation in one area, while the other varieties of the same crop inherited the mutation of another area. This is how we see the different varieties of the same plant that might seem exactly the same, but are not actually the same. What was it about the Americas and Africa that made the spread of food production more difficult there than in Eurasia? The answer is this question. Let's begin by examining the rapid spread of food production out of the Southwest Asia, the Fertile Crescent. Of course, not all species of the package spread to all outlying areas. For example, Egypt was too warm for einkorn wheat to become established. Like I said earlier, when we're talking about packages of foods that come from particularly the Fertile Crescent, the areas that allowed for different varieties of wild plants to be domesticated, not all the areas were acceptable. For example, Egypt was too warm for einkorn wheat when it came to be established, which means that in the variety of foods that came to Egypt, einkorn was not one of those. So when we're talking about our writing, what we can keep in mind is that some areas are not going to be applicable to the types of plants that we're looking to do. One of the ways that we can add variety to our stories is actually have certain types of food unable to be produced in certain types of areas. This gives our worlds a rich and diverse understanding and actual legitimate biomes for what can be found in different areas. This will give life to our worlds that we are trying to create. So for instance, if I am creating a world that is more like the English countryside, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to have a lot of palm trees in those areas, because palm trees aren't going to survive the harsh winters of the UK climate. Just like we do when we're talking about other types of food, the same thing can be said for other types of creatures and animals. For instance, you can't necessarily take a husky dog and put them in Egypt and they're going to do well. They are bred for a very specific type of climate, and they don't do well in very hot climates. In some outlying areas, elements of the package arrived at different times. For instance, sheep preceded cereals in southwestern Europe. So cereals is the term that they use for wheat. So when we're talking about wheat, different types of wheat, whether barley, wheat, elkhorn wheat, these are called cereals. So what they're saying here is that sheep were actually making it out easier than it was for them to plant foods in southwestern Europe. This makes sense because it's easier for sheep to actually eat the grass that is going to be already there, whereas cereals, these wheat, might have to adapt over the course of time to make sure that they are able to grow in those areas. Why did some plant package launch food production throughout Western Eurasia? Was it because the same set of plants occurred in the wild in many areas, were found useful there just as in the Fertile Crescent, and were independently domesticated? No, that's not the reason. First, many of the Fertile Crescent founder crops didn't even occur in the wild outside of Southwest Asia. When we're talking about founder crops, we're talking about those domesticates that actually spread across the whole world. So you could almost say that there was a bubble around the Fertile Crescent where there was an exclusion zone for these plants that they couldn't spread naturally. They actually had to be picked up and carried into these areas. So for instance, as you have people growing and developing and spreading out, they are bringing these crops with them into these areas that they can use these crops to provide for themselves food. And this is typically seen more recently in the past 2,000 to 3,000 years rather than before that. For instance, none of the 8 main founder crops except barley grows wild in Egypt. Egypt's Nile Valley provides an environment similar to the Fertile Crescent, Tigris, and Euphrates valleys. Basically, the idea here is the fact that some plant species have a very narrow type of environment that allows for it to be grown in it. So for instance, wild barley that was found in the Fertile Crescent, Tigris, and Euphrates valleys made leaps and bounds in the Egypt's Nile Valley. But this is, as we said earlier, wasn't something that allowed it to have different areas more northwest. Localities distributed east and west of each other at the same latitude share exactly the same day length and its seasonal variations. To a lesser degree, they also tend to share similar diseases, regimens of temperature and rainfall, and habitats or biomes, types of vegetation. This is what I was saying earlier when we're talking about different latitudinal lines. You have day-night length that allows for different types of environments to become common. Not to say that when we're talking about climate as it's fluctuating, but there's going to be a more consistent pattern of how the plants actually have the ability to survive. But the germination, growth, and disease resistance of the plants are adapted to precisely those features of climate. Seasonal changes of day length, temperature, and rainfall constitute signals that stimulate seeds to germinate, seedlings to grow, and mature plants to develop flowers, seeds, and fruit. It's just not the fact that you have certain types of areas that are beneficial for the plant, but rather the mutations and the germination and the DNA sequence that is in the seed itself requires a certain set of signals for it to start growing. For instance, you don't want wheat seeds to actually start growing right away. So what they require is a certain set of indications, environmental indications, particularly an abundance of water, to actually start growing. What can happen is if that area is too dry, that plant is not going to grow. So these are different things that have to be taken into account when our farmers are growing. Woe betide the plant whose genetic program is mismatched for the latitude in the field in which it's planted. The unfortunate corn plant, following its Mexico adapted genetic program, could prepare to thrust up its shoots in March, only to find itself still buried under 10 feet of snow. Because corn, in this particular example, grows at a much slower rate, it shows up a lot earlier. In March, there's a lot of time for it to grow slowly over the course of the year. Whereas if they tried to do that, say in Canada, what could end up causing the problem is that because it's such a long drawn out process, that in March when it needs to start, it's already going to find itself under snow. And even if we change it to the point where we actually begin planting it much later, you're actually going to see issues when it comes to, by the time it's ready to be harvested, it's going to be hit with frost. Should the plant become genetically reprogrammed so that it can germinate at the time more appropriate to Canada, let's say late June, the plant will still be in trouble for other reasons. The gene would be telling it to grow it at a leisurely rate sufficient only to bring it to maturity in 5 months. That's a perfectly safe strategy in Mexico's mild climate, but in Canada, a disastrous one that could guarantee the plants being killed by autumn frosts before it had produced any mature corn cobs. The idea that they're talking about is the fact that each plant has its own genetic sequences that it plays out according to how it developed over the course of millennia. And so what we see here is that it's not easy to say, well, we just take corn and we stick it in this area. Each plant has its own genetic variable that requires a certain set of ticks when it comes to how it's planted and whatnot. The plant would also lack the genes for resistance to disease of northern climates, while uselessly carrying genes for resistance to diseases in southern climates. So the thing here is that we're not necessarily even talking about weather, but also different resistance to diseases. In the soil, there are different bacteria, and those bacteria can be beneficial or they can be bad for the plant. In the south, where the corn is originally located, it's adapted to grow in those areas, whereas in the north, it's not adapted to those particular diseases and whatnot that are already in the area and are more likely to become susceptible. It's the same idea that we had when we're talking about diseases for humans. Because humans grew in conjunction with animals in Europe, when they came over to America, the diseases actually killed off 90% of the Native American population, even before we actually came into contact with them. Animals too are adapted to latitude-related features of the climate. In that respect, we are typical animals as we know by introspection. Some of us can't stand cold of northern winters with their short days and their characteristic germs, while others can't stand hot tropical climates with their own characteristic diseases. We see this also in different places like in Africa. When European colonists moved into Africa, they suffered a lot from the different areas and different diseases from the areas. Similarly, the spread southward of Fertile Crescent domestic animals through Africa was stopped or slowed by climate and diseases, especially by trypanosoma diseases carried by tsetse flies. The horse never became established further south than West Africa's kingdom north of the equator. The idea here is that the tsetse flies, when we're talking about malaria and different types of diseases, they were very susceptible to those diseases, whereas the bovine that lived in the area were less because they developed the genetic resistance to those diseases. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. Basically, the idea here is I just wanted to get over the concept. The fact is that different areas have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the crops that we have for our characters. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to create a world that doesn't make sense for the reader. So for, like I mentioned earlier, if you have a world where it is a very Germanic or it's UK or a Northern European, it doesn't make a lot of sense for to to have specific types of species of plants. Now, that's not to say that if you take specific plants from those areas that they're not going to flourish well in different areas, but you have to show a pattern of this. So for instance, the tobacco crop was very popular in the UK when the Americans started to develop the tobacco plant, and they found that it grew amazingly well. You see this also with different invasive species. So one of the things that we keep in mind here is that we can use all of these different elements to help create a real living, breathing world. This is why I'm doing all of this work on guns, germs, and steels, because I want to see a lot more in our worlds when it comes to how vibrant it is. All right, that's all I had for today. As always, I will link all the information I use in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger